I didn't know that there was. Is there normally this many debates during the election season? Seems like there's a debate like every other night now. Lot of debates, a lot of discussion, a lot of politics going on. All right, let's just get it out there. How many of you enjoy politics? Put your hand up. It's okay. We're not going to stone you. Okay. How many of you enjoy the debates? How many of you do not like politics? Really? How many of you don't really care one way or the other? Okay. So I think maybe those that are voting, they don't like it is because you feel like you're inundated with it right now. Like everywhere we turn, it's there. The political system is a natural part of a civil society, right? So whether we like it or not, like politics is a reality for us. Here's another question. How many of you are suspicious of the government? I think we reached an unanimous decision on that one. How many of you do not trust politicians? Really? Like you guys don't trust Donald? I'm just kidding. Not a politician. Good one. So we are bombarded by politics. Debates, mudslinging, the amount of money that is spent on campaigns is overwhelming. I heard just this morning that the Jeb Bush campaign has spent $43 million in New Hampshire alone. Just in New Hampshire. The amount of money that is spent on campaigns is overwhelming. Super PACs, we hear all these phrases thrown around. Politicians, some say, are like diapers. They need to be changed regularly for the same reason. I'm just kidding. The political system is just a part of a civil society, right? There's more political jokes than I have time to tell right now. And telling political jokes kind of goes against the gist of the message. I'll throw in just one, okay? Then I'll ask for forgiveness. So I heard that they put the new Bernie Sanders plan into action in McDonald's to give it a trial run. And so what happens is you go up to the counter and you order whatever it is that you want to order, and then the guy behind you pays for it. And then you have to split whatever it is you order with the stranger standing beside you. So if you know politics, you know you'll get that joke. Like it or not, politics is a necessary, ready for this, God-ordained part of life. Every time I get fed up with politics, I remind myself, what is the other choice? Like the other option is anarchy. And I don't think any of us want to sign up for that. And so the political system is a necessary, some would say evil, but a God-ordained part of life. So here's the question for today. What is the proper relationship between Jesus followers and people of authority? Especially those who are antagonistic toward followers of Jesus. How involved should we be in the political system? Should we ignore it? Should we engage it? Should we work in favor of a certain candidate, a certain policy, a certain way of life? Should we vote? Like these are all legitimate, in-your-face questions that we have to wrestle with as followers of Jesus. Now, this is not a new question. In the Old Testament, much of the history of the people of God is that they were under the control of some other empire. For 400 years, older than the history of our own country, for 400 years the Israelites were under the rule and reign of the Egyptians. 400 years. The Israelites were also conquered by Babylonians, by Persians, by Assyrians, by every ite that you can read about in the Old Testament. Every type of Jun or ite, the Hittites, the Persians, everybody that was out there, it seemed like at some point ruled over God's people. In the New Testament, the followers of Jesus were living under the rule and reign of the Roman Empire. As a matter of fact, when our book was written, the book of 1 Peter, Nero was in charge. Now you're talking about the tyranny of a madman. Nero was insane. He was responsible for having both Peter and Paul killed. Believers were mistreated at every level. As a matter of fact, our little book, 1 Peter, the theme of it is suffering. And a lot of that suffering had to do with what was happening in civil society. Their relationship with the government. Their relationship with the empire under which they lived. The control of the Roman emperors. And so when Peter writes this book, he is speaking very street-level language, very street-level faith. And the theme of 1 Peter, as we said, is suffering, but the predominant question is, how are we to follow Christ in a Christless culture? How are we to follow Jesus in a culture that often is controlled by people who are far from followers of Jesus? And today he talks about two of the toughest: government and work. Like, it doesn't get any more street level than that, right? Like, how do we live in a society with politicians and politics and government structure? And how do we live in a society when we oftentimes are working under the authority of someone else? How do we live and function as Jesus followers under the authority, often with people with whom we disagree? And if we remember how Peter is writing his book, we learn that this question has less to do with the how and the what, and it has more to do with the who we are. That we are exiles, the title of our series, who are passing through, and yet, even as exiles who are passing on to another land, even as exiles, and this is not our eternal home, and this is not our ultimate kingdom, even as exiles passing through, we are forced into this situation where we have to live life in the here and now. That we live life in all of its good and all of its bad, and its governments and its politicians and those employers that we don't like, and we live life in the here and now. How do we interact? How do we live as Jesus followers? Peter has called us aliens, meaning we have a home that is beyond this home. So does that mean as aliens, as exiles, that we have no civic responsibility at all? Obviously, the answer to that question is no. It means the exact opposite. As a matter of fact, that's what we're going to look at today. If you have a Bible, grab it. We're going to be in 1 Peter. Turn to the small book of 1 Peter. If you're unsure where that's at, you can start at the end. Come past maps, concordances, all those fun things to the book of Revelation, and then back up about 3 or 4 small books, and we come to the little letter called 1 Peter, written by one of the big dogs in the 12, Peter the Apostle, who had an interesting history with government and with politicians, and who had an interesting history with Jesus. And here the seasoned disciple writes this letter to these followers of Jesus who have been scattered throughout what we know now as Asia Minor, throughout the Roman Empire. And he's writing to Jesus followers who are wrestling with the questions that we're talking about today. Who are wrestling with how do we function in a culture that is very anti who we are as followers of Christ. If you've been with us in the first chapter and a half, through chapter 2 and verse 12, we've talked a lot about who we are. And now Peter breaks it down to street-level faith. Beginning in verse 13, based on everything he said up until this point, look what he says, chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. Be subject, and another translation of this would be submit. Submit for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who are good. Peter starts out with a dirty word, doesn't he? Submit. Like be in submission. Be subject. Like we don't like that word. We don't like the word submit. But Peter says that submission is the proper response to those that God has placed over us. That the proper way that we respond as Jesus followers to those who have been placed over us is this idea of placing ourselves under subjection and submission to them. It's actually a military word that means to willfully place yourself under the submission of someone else. How many of you in here served in the military in some capacity? Hold your hand up. Like, you get this, right? Like, you get, like, you don't really have a choice, but you don't jump from private to 5-star general in military ranks. There's a whole structure of placing yourself under, either willfully or unwillfully, the submission of someone else. It's a rank issue. This is not an easy task. And yet Peter says, submit to those that God has placed over you. Here's why this is so difficult for us as Americans. The USA was founded on a revolution. Like, we started as a revolutionary people. Government defiance is a constitutional right in America at times. Ben Franklin, one of our founding fathers, used to say, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Like, we were founded with that type of mentality as a revolution. When I was doing a lot of traveling this week with my job, and I was sitting in an airport. When you travel a lot and have to write messages, you find yourself writing messages in a lot of different contexts, in airports and thinking about it on the drive to wherever you're going, and in a hotel room late at night. And so as I was kind of crafting this message mentally and putting some stuff down on paper, I was sitting in an airport thinking about these two verses and jotting a few things down. And in the airport, while writing this message, came these words in the form of a song that we all know so well. We're not going to take it. We're not going to take it. We're not going to take it anymore. Right? Like, we're a revolutionary people. Like, we're not going to take it anymore. So how do we live in submission? How do we subject ourselves to those that God has placed in authority? Here is the key to understanding this. The foundation of this principle is this: choosing to submit to those in authority over us honors God because human institutions are under God's control. Choosing to submit to those that God has placed in authority over us honors God because human institutions, as Peter said here, are under God's control. Did you notice back in verse 13, verse 13, he says, be subject. Those next four words are something for us to dwell upon. Be subject for the Lord's sake. Ultimately, we are honoring God through submission, living under subjection to those that God has placed over us. Now, let's be really frank with each other. This raises some tough questions. Like, what do I do if the policies of the government structure over me opposes my beliefs, my values? What about evil rulers? Like, why does God allow evil rulers? Why does God allow the Hitlers of the world? Why did God allow Joseph Stalin? I mean, we could just go through the list, right, of world leaders who have had so much negative impact and death and sin and destruction. Like, why does God allow them? In the Old Testament, time and time again, God seems to raise up evil rulers. A lot of times God raised up evil rulers to do what? To judge his people. Because they were living out from under God's control. And God would raise up rulers of this world to judge them. But what about all these questions? Like, how do we wrestle with these things? How do we struggle with these things? Particularly with leaders with which we disagree. Is it ever right to disobey? If you like reading like biographies of church history or things like that, there's an interesting guy that was actually around during the time of Hitler that lived in Germany. He was a Lutheran pastor by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. His biography is fascinating to read. Like, how does this pastor function in Nazi Germany when hundreds of thousands of people were being killed and murdered? What is a pastor in that context supposed to do? And the biography of Bonhoeffer is fascinating as he wrestled with that question. To kind of fast forward through the whole story and give you the end of his life, Bonhoeffer, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, this is what he did in his context, but Bonhoeffer actually fought against the Nazi regime and was supposedly a part of a conspiracy to have Hitler killed. So like, here's this Lutheran pastor that was caught in this conspiracy to have Hitler killed, and Bonhoeffer actually was executed, I think 3 days before they came into the concentration camp where they were holding him and liberated it. The Allied forces came in and liberated that concentration camp. Bonhoeffer was killed 3 days before that happened. So here was a pastor that was caught in that dilemma, like, how do I, under this rule of Adolf Hitler and all this going on, what's right and wrong for me to do as a pastor? And it's a fascinating read to read how he struggled with that question. How do we live in a culture that is anti-Jesus? We just heard yesterday of the death of Supreme Court Justice Scalia, and what do we do when a guy that seems to have strong Judeo-Christian values, whatever that looks like today, now he's gone and he's dead and he's going to be replaced, and like, what do we do? What do we as Jesus followers do in these moments? Here's what you need to know. I don't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers. What I do know is this is more about posture than anything. How do we respond to those who have been placed over us? Here's what we can know. We can know that it is under God's sovereign control. It's under God's control. No matter who it is, what they look like, what their beliefs are, what their policies are, what things they pass or don't pass, that we agree or disagree, it's under God's absolute sovereign control. And according to Peter in these verses, dishonoring those in authority over us is dishonoring God. Anybody else wrestle with that reality? The things we say, the pot shots we take, the snide remarks we make, dishonoring those that have been placed in authority over us is ultimately dishonoring to God. Now, we'll spell that out a little bit in a few moments, what that looks like. Let's jump ahead, and I want to give you some things here. I'm going to lay out for you what Peter lays out for us on why we submit to those in authority for Christ's sake. Okay, that's the key words here. For Jesus' sake, for Christ's sake, this is why we submit to those in authority. The first thing he told us, we read in verse 14, let's go back to it. Governors as sent by him, the him here is God, is sent by God to do what? To punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. And so Peter tells us that part of the reason that we live in submission is because government performs a God-ordained role in society. Government does perform a God-ordained role in society. Government is a means, a tool by which God uses to do two things, he says in this verse: to invoke justice and to promote peace, to deter sin and to promote goodness. Government functions in that capacity, to punish evil and to reward good. And Peter says that that is God ordained, that God set up government structure, societal structure, for those two purposes, to punish evil and to do good. This is a constant question that rises in this conversation. Should government legislate morality? Like, we hear that all the time. May not be asked exactly like that, but that's a question that we ask and talk about and hear discussed all the time. Should government legislate morality? There's been a lot of news in recent years of moral issues that have been legislated by our government. And so this question always comes up. Should government legislate morality? And according to this verse, government does legislate some level of morality. Let me tell you what that means for us. Government tells us, and again reacts according to what happens, that murder's wrong. Like, we live in a society where it's against the law to murder someone. I'm glad. I'm thankful that we live in that type of society where certain morality is legislated. It's wrong for someone to walk into your house and pick up your big screen TV and walk out with it. That's considered wrong. That's morality that's been legislated that says you can't steal from other people. We could mention 100 things here, right, of moral issues that have been legislated. Here's the point. Listen to me closely if you're a follower of Jesus. If legislation of government mirrors or reflects biblical ethics, then we support it. You see, I believe that murder is wrong, not because the government says it's wrong, but because the Bible says it's wrong. Now, government supports that principle and legislates morality. It says if you murder someone, here is your punishment. And by reading these verses, we realize that God has given them that role. That principle, that moral principle, supports biblical principles. The conflict happens when those two worlds don't come together, right? When government says that something is right or wrong, that the Bible says the opposite. And I believe in those cases, as we see in the life of Peter himself, Peter and John were hauled before the government officials of their day, and they said to them, you are not allowed to preach the name of Jesus. Stop preaching. At that moment, their biblical ethics and the legislation of morality by the government were in conflict. So what did Peter say? Peter said, look, I'm going to obey someone here, but it's not you. We are going to live in obedience to God over humans. And so when those two worlds collide, our responsibility as God followers, as Jesus followers, is to obey biblical truth and ethics. We obey God. Here's the key for us. Disobeying civil laws, listen to me closely, disobeying civil laws that are not violating Scripture is disobedience to God. If we choose disobedience to laws that are not violating Scripture, we are being dishonoring to God. Now, there's different levels of laws, right? I'm not saying just pick and choose. But what I am saying is if you drive 66 miles per hour in a 65 mile per hour speed zone, then you're not disobeying God per se. Okay? So don't mishear me. If so, then I'm living in sin every time I get in the car. Trust me. As a matter of fact, one time when I was pastoring in southern Indiana, I had a couple of state troopers in my church. And one of them didn't recognize my car and pulled me over for speeding, which is always fun when he walks up to the car and attends your church. But he walked up to the window of my car, and he saw it was me, and he had this like laugh that broke out and a smile on his face. And he's like, Devin, he's like, dude, I didn't know it was you. He's like, look, you've got divine immunity. Don't worry about it. Divine immunity. What I've learned since that time is he's the only cop that feels that way, trust me. I don't get to pull the divine immunity card ever when I get pulled over. You know, the amazing thing is when I moved moved to the South from the West Coast, speed limits pretty much in all big cities, but particularly on the West Coast, are more like suggestions than rules and laws. And so people drive really fast in big cities across the country, and particularly on the West Coast. When I came back here, I realized like they want you to drive the speed limit. So I got pulled over like 7 times in the first year that I was here for speeding. In every one of those instances, I got one ticket, and that ticket was for having my windows too dark on my car and not the speed that I was driving. So you would think between the two of us that my sweet, beautiful little wife would be the one that constantly gets out of tickets. But between the two of us, I don't think she's ever gotten out of a ticket. And I've gotten out of all tickets. Maybe it says something about my ability to communicate or be honest or what, because I never try to beat around the bush. Like, look, dude, I was driving too fast. I get it. But actually, I did get a ticket last Christmas. But then a cop in my dad's church got me out of that ticket. So I guess I didn't technically get the ticket. But point being, I don't always get divine immunity. But I'm not talking about we drive 5 mile an hour over. I did hear about one pastor that tried to tell the cops in his church he had divine immunity, and the cop replied, well, I've got a divine mandate too. Jesus said, go out into the highways and bring them in. And so he's like, that's my calling too. But so there's this constant, do we obey? Do we disobey? And I believe that what this scripture teaches is that we obey civic laws that fit under the umbrella of biblical ethics. And to not do so is violating Scripture. Laws that reflect moral guidelines, we are to obey. That's why I like this issue with should we or should we not smoke marijuana, or what about underage drinking? Like, all of that stuff is already laid out. Like, there's no reason to question that, because those are civil laws that have been put in place that reflect biblical guidelines. So we obey them. We live under the authority that God has placed over us. Let's jump to verse 15. What's the next reason that Peter says, for Christ's sake we do these things. Verse 15, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Peter says submission to authority silences critics. The word silence here means to muzzle, to cause someone to go quiet, to provide no reason for rebuke. As followers, our lives speak of our submission to our greater King, that we follow King Jesus. And our lives should reflect that. And by submitting to those that God has placed over us, Peter says you do not give the critics a reason to question you, to question your faith. Here's how that breaks down for us. We are not to be known as people of revolt. We're not to be known as people of anarchy. Matter of fact, one of Jesus' disciples was a zealot. You know what the zealots were? They were like, we hate the Roman Empire. We'll do everything we can to defeat the Roman Empire. We'll work kind of this covert, secret society. Every time we get a chance to knock off a Roman official, we will. We'll murder people. We will fight by violence. And one of those followers of Jesus, or one of those people became a follower of Jesus. And Jesus told him to live in peace and not to exercise revolt and anarchy. Followers of Jesus should be known of people of peace, living under submission, to silence the critics. Verse 16, another reason Peter gives us. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. So Peter says that submission, being subject to these government structures that have been placed over us, affirms our freedom in Jesus. So instead of being people of anarchy, people of revolt, Peter says you want to live as a free person, you live under the authority that God has placed over you. That there is freedom in living under the rule and reign of God's ordained structures. Now this is very countercultural. This is very against the modern mindset. What Peter's saying is that following Jesus, listen, this is so important. Following Jesus pushes us towards serving. Following Jesus does not push us toward entitlement or revolt. Man, we live in an entitled society. I want my rights. I want this. I want that. I'm entitled to this. How dare you trample on my rights? Like, we live in a society that is centered around rights. My rights, my entitlement, what you owe me. Like, that defines our culture. And yet Peter says that if we're following Jesus, we should be pushed toward serving, not toward entitlement or rebellion. And he equates it with being a free person. Live as a free person. Don't subject yourself to anger and bitterness and rebellion and slander and all the things that come that are sinful with living a life of rebellion against those that God has placed over you. Peter says you're free. Live like a free person. It doesn't matter who the king is or the president is or who's over you or who your government is. Don't allow those political structures to hold you captive. Peter's saying you're free. You're bigger than that. Live like a free person. Why would you subject yourself to the chains of bitterness and anger? God's put those structures in place to enable you to live as a free person, not as an entitled person. It pushes us toward serving. We'll come back to that in a moment. Here's what the great reformer Luther said. Christianity is perfectly free Lord of all. Christians are perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none. But Christians are perfectly dutiful servants of all, subject to all. See what Luther is saying? As a Christian, I'm subject to no one outside of Jesus. But as a Christian, I am servant to everyone. Live as a free person, which pushes us toward serving people. And then look at 17. He summarizes for us in these incredible 4 statements. 17, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Peter says submission, being subject to the authorities God has placed over you, affects your view of other people. And look at the fourfold calling he gives us here. First he says, honor everyone. Everyone. Why should I honor everyone? Here's what honor everyone is. Honor everyone is that I see and recognize and realize that everyone is made in God's image just like me. That I value people because they too have been created in God's image. And isn't that tough? Isn't it tough when we kind of fit into these stereotypes of our culture and we see it on the news and people are pushing you in a certain direction to think this based on your gender, your skin color, where you were born and raised, your socioeconomic standing. Like we push boundaries in every direction. You should think this way because you're a white person. You should behave this way because you're a black person. Because you're raised here, this is how you should think and do and look down on these people. And yet, in the midst of all that, Peter says, look, learn to value people for who they are, which is that every person has been created in God's image. Can you imagine if we lived life that way? And instead of judging the person that looks differently than me or behaves differently than me or says things differently than me or looks a certain way or dresses a certain way or wear their pants a certain way, instead of judging them, if I was able to stop and think that person is as valuable to God as I am. Ashley and I went to see the movie about the Benghazi incident, 13 Hours. And I don't want to get into the whole story about it, but it was basically 4 Americans lost their lives, and there was in the war-torn country of Liberia, which is still today that way. But in the midst of all that, not only did 4 Americans lose their lives, but literally dozens and dozens and dozens of Liberians lost their lives. And I thought in that moment, watching the movie, obviously I'm kind of drawn toward, we're protecting American life and all that, but I thought in that moment, like every person that died in that incident, no matter what label they were wearing, every person that died was created in God's image. Like that's an overwhelming thought, isn't it? And we live in a very war-torn society and protecting our rights as Americans. And I don't have all the answers for all that. But what I do know is that every person in the world, whatever label they're wearing, is a person that's been created in God's image just like me. And that our hearts should connect to that somehow. Honor everyone, Peter says. And this is not a guy that was able to make these statements easy, right? He lived suffering and being persecuted. And yet he said, treat people with value. Value them as God does. And then he says, love the brotherhood. We've talked about that in the last few weeks, how as Jesus followers, our hearts are knit together with other Jesus followers, that we protect family, that we have this love of Christ that's shed abroad in our hearts that connects us to other followers of Christ. We are grace-filled people, and because we have received grace, that should display itself in how we treat other people, particularly people that are other Jesus followers. And then he says, fear God. In other words, live a life of reverent awe, of recognizing who God is, and that will impact. And then he gives us this last one, which maybe is tougher than all of the previous ones. Honor the emperor. In other words, value those who are over you. Value them. Honor them. And again, I don't know all the balance here. I don't have all the answers. I know there was times that Jesus looked at Herod and said, you're a fox. And I know there's times where believers in Jesus have stood up to people of authority and defended their faith, and it cost them their lives. And I don't know all the balance here. I just know that in this context, Peter says that your posture should be one of honoring, if nothing else, the position over the person. There are people that are elected officials that are sinful, evil people that I disagree with their decision-making and the consequences of those decisions. And I'm not saying that we applaud every decision that's made because it's made by a person, but there's a level of respect for the position itself, even if we disagree with the person, that our posture should be one of honor and value. Imagine if we lived life with this paradigm. That we valued other people as God's creation. That we loved each other deeply. That we live a life in reverence of God. That we value those that God has placed over me. As we've said week in and week out, it's more about the who than it is the what. When I see who I am in Jesus, it causes me to react in certain ways. Let's go even deeper, street level, 18 through 20. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, and look at this phrase, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. Peter says that submission enables us to respond with grace even when we're being treated poorly. This is street-level faith, isn't it? How do I respond to an unfair boss? How do I react when I'm falsely accused, when that boss doesn't like me, when I don't like that person I'm working under? How do I react when I'm being mistreated? And Peter says the proper response to mistreatment is the opportunity to demonstrate grace at the highest level. And the underlying promise of these entire 3 verses is being mindful of God, remembering His grace. Again, I'm not acting like this is easy. It's not, is it? It's difficult. It's street-level faith. It's living out grace because we've received grace. And we've been mistreated and being treated unfairly and unjustly. How do we respond? In that moment, we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to respond as people of bondage, being held captive by anger or bitterness or slander, or we have an opportunity to respond as free people. That I'm not going to be held captive to those sinful emotions. I'm going to live as a free person. I'm going to demonstrate grace even when it is not shown to me. And then Peter takes it real. He says, you want to talk about this at a level you'll understand it? Let me give you the ultimate example of this type of submission. Look in 21. For to this you have been called. Why? Because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in His steps. Peter says we respond in submission. We respond with grace even when mistreated and suffering, because this is how Jesus responded for us. We follow in His steps. Jesus took my suffering so that I might respond in grace when I suffer. Jesus took what I deserve so that I might respond in a grace-filled way when people sin against me. 22. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in His mouth. When He was reviled, He did not revile in return. When He suffered, He did not threaten, but continued entrusting Himself to Him who judges justly. There's so much depth in these verses that what Jesus did enables me to respond in grace. When Jesus was sinned against, He did not sin. When Jesus was talked about, He kept His words under control. When Jesus was reviled against, He did not seek revenge. When Jesus suffered unjustly, He did not threaten. He did not seek retribution. Now, I want to tell you, this is not a natural response, is it? It's a supernatural response. And think about who did this. He was 100% innocent. What I've discovered in my life is when I'm working under someone else's authority and we have to have that conversation where things are not going according to plan, even if I disagree with them slightly, I'm usually at fault at some level. Jesus was 100% innocent in every way, and get this, He had the power to invoke justice. Jesus could have said, enough is enough. I'm the King of Kings. I'm 100% pure and right and holy. And yet, Jesus relinquished His rights in order to do what? To trust God. We read it. To entrust himself to the final judge. Jesus did not demand his rights. Jesus did not take the entitlement card. Jesus did not stomp his foot and say, but I deserve this. Instead, he said, I serve a greater judge who is in absolute control, and I entrust myself to him. Again, hear your pastor closely. I don't have all the answers here. And I'm not talking about that you get trampled upon and taken advantage of, but what I know is that you, as a Jesus follower, will be treated unfairly at times. The New Testament is clear on that. You will be treated unfairly. You will suffer. And there are times when we relinquish our rights and simply trust God, because he is the ultimate judge. And guess what? You are an exile passing through. And one day you will stand before the ultimate judge who will make all wrongs right. And we rest in him. I don't know what that means for you at work every day. I don't know what that means when you're being taken advantage of and someone's out to get you and things don't seem to be fair. But what I do know is that there are times you will be treated unfairly. You will be treated in a way that you have to go through suffering, and you will have the opportunity in those moments to respond in a way that mirrors Jesus or a way that mirrors us. And there are times that we have to relinquish our rights and say, God, I don't get this, but I trust you. And again, I'm not saying you get trampled upon and taken advantage of all the time and that you're a doormat at work. But what I'm saying is that there are times that you relinquish your rights and trust the Father. Because he is the ultimate judge, and he is good, and he can be trusted. 24. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. Peter takes us right back to the gospel. What Jesus did enables us to respond in grace. And look at the gospel purpose he gives us here. That Jesus did all of this. He took your place so that you might die to sin and live to righteousness. That the gospel enables us to live a life that is marked by grace. I love that last little phrase in that verse. By his wounds you've been healed. He's doing a throwback to the book of Isaiah. Here's what I take from that. If you're a follower of Jesus, live like a healed person. You're not a wounded person. You may have the consequences of wounds that have been invoked on you by other people. But in Jesus, you have been healed. You find healing in him. Here's what I've learned in my own life and the life of other people. Hurt people hurt people. People who have been hurt often hurt other people. Wounded people wound people. And some of you grew up in environments, or you may be living in one now, where you've been hurt. You've been wounded. And the hurt and the pain and the scars run deep. And your tendency is to hurt and wound because you've been hurt and you've been wounded. Hear the gospel today. Hear it. Jesus wants to heal your soul. He wants to heal your wounds so that you do not live like a hurt person, that you do not live like a wounded person, but you live like a person who has been healed by his stripes, that what he did on the cross, he took your wounds for you. He took your hurt for you. Rest in him, because healed people seek healing. Healed people offer healing. Healed people offer reconciliation and peace and grace. Why? Not because of how awesome we are, but because He took my wounds and my hurts on the cross. Last verse, 25. For you were straying like sheep. Again, throwback to Isaiah. You were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your soul. Remember, like a pathetic sheep, you were wandering away from God. And He sought you. And He redeemed you. And He reconciled you. And He is the shepherd and overseer of your soul. That He's watching after you. That He's overseeing your soul. That He's tending to your wounds. We don't have time to jump into what is the shepherd, what did they do. But at the end of the day, the role of the shepherd was to oversee the sheep and to keep them from danger and to keep them from harm and to heal them and wound them and to oversee them. And Peter says, you have a God who's watching over you. He pursued you when you were running away. And He's brought you into His flock and redeemed you and healed you for His glory. You see, my ultimate submission and allegiance is to the shepherd of my soul. And that impacts how I respond to those who have been placed in authority over me here. As I said at the beginning, it's a posture issue. Who I am in Jesus impacts how I respond. Here's a phrase that I thought of this week that I want you to take home with you. That we are to live lives in this situation with all the complexity of government and society and who do we obey, what do we do, unfair boss, all the complexity we've talked about. That we are to live life with a grace-based posture. Grace is a way of life. A grace-based posture. Here's what grace-based posture is about. Grace-based posture is about serving, not entitlement. That I will serve. And at times I will relinquish my rights to serve other people. Grace-based posture respects offices of authority, even when we disagree with them. That when we disagree, we do so with a grace-based posture that respects the position of authority that God has placed over us, even while disagreeing. Grace-based posture, here's a tough one, values those that God has placed over me. Man, that's tough when you disagree with the person, right? Grace-based posture values those God has placed over me. Why? Because we recognize it's God who's placed them there. There's not a single world leader ruling and reigning today outside of God's sovereign control. Grace-based posture turns mistreatment into opportunity. That when I'm being treated unfairly, it's an opportunity for me to respond in grace and point people to Jesus. Grace-based posture is marked, as we've heard in these verses, by obedience, by submission, by respect, and by good deeds. Grace-based posture seeks, listen to this, seeks to understand people, to understand them, and to promote their highest good. Instead of just disagreeing with somebody because they have a different position or they hold this or hold that, what if I really stopped and sought to understand them and promote their highest good even when I disagree with them? Here's the last one. This is key to City Church. Grace-based posture seeks the shalom, the welfare, the good of a city, of a society. Let me show you an interesting passage as we end today. Jeremiah chapter 29. Jeremiah is writing a letter to the people of God who are being held in captivity. And he calls them, interesting enough, exiles. Look what Jeremiah says in 29, verse 4, again, instructing God's people, speaking on behalf of God to his people. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel. So what does he do? He reminds them who they are. Hey, don't forget, you're the people of God. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent. So this is God initiated. Whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. And look what the instructions of God to his people living in exile. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. Then look at 7. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to God on its behalf. For it is welfare you will find for in its welfare you will find your welfare. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophets and your diviners who are among you deceive you, and do not listen to them for that dream. What God is saying via Jeremiah is, I've put you there. Set up camp. Raise families. Be good workers. Be a functioning part of society. Promote the welfare, the shalom, the wholeness, we say here. Promote the shalom of the city. Be in the city and be for the city. That's what grace-based posture is. We are people passing through, but God has placed us strategically right where we are. That we are in Decatur, Alabama, and Trinity, Alabama, and Hartselle, and wherever it is that you live, that God has strategically placed you at this point in time in your location to live life with a grace-based posture. In the city, for the city, pointing people to Jesus. Do not forget who wrote this and when he wrote it. Peter, writing under the rule and reign of Nero. Evil, vicious, immoral, a murderer. At the age of 16, he took the throne from his mother through manipulation. He banished his own mom from the kingdom and eventually murdered her when he was 18 years old and all of his heirs. He poisoned his closest friend at 17. He had his oldest and wisest advisor killed because he suggested something with which he disagreed. And as we started the whole entire Exile series, if you remember, he set his own city on fire, set his own city ablaze, and blamed the Christians for it. He stole tax funds. He stole public money to build his own house, and in the process erected a 100-foot statue of himself to overlook his kingdom. His own Senate and his closest Praetorian Guard turned against him, and he fled and he hid and he killed himself in suicide at the age of 31. And before his death, Nero wrote these words, "What an artist dies in me." You kidding me? Self-absorbed, cruel. And his persecution started centuries of persecution against Christians until they became the most victimized people in human history. Nero and Peter, whom Nero had murdered, wrote, "Honor the king." How? Why? Because I'm a dual citizen. And my ultimate king is Jesus. And he is in control. And he's a good king. And my future's in his hands. And I belong to the King of Kings. And for that reason, my life is marked by his grace. And grace is a way of life. How are we doing? The challenge for me, the challenge for you, because of the gospel, we take a grace-based posture. And we point people to the King of Kings while living in submission to those that God has placed in authority over us in the here and now. Let's do this. We're going to end with prayer. This prayer is going to be different than our normal end the service in prayer. We're going to take a moment and we're going to pray for those that God has placed in authority over us. It's a crazy time in our country. Who's going to be president? Who's going to be in charge? This, that. And what I want you to do is, as I pray, I want you to pray for those that God has placed in authority over you. That boss that gets on your nerves and seems to treat you unfairly. That person that somehow has some say in your life, a parent, a teacher, a whoever, that has some role of authority in your life with which you disagree. The president, whoever it is in your life, as I pray, I want you to pray, and I want your prayer to be, God, give me a grace-based posture toward, and you name them, and you pray for them in your heart and soul. We serve the King of Kings who's in control, and he gave his life that we might follow in his steps. Let's bow our heads for prayer.